What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and while I can't show you anything, I can talk about now as my embargo has lifted on the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. So I've had it for a little bit now, and I've read through it, and I can honestly say it is the best Dungeon Master's Guide written by Wizards of the Coast that I've seen thus far. It has a ton of really useful information, especially if you're a new DM looking for things and you want like an actual tool set for yourself. This is really good. It also has a lot of good information for you as even a veteran DM, and it quantifies things that perhaps some of us didn't think needed quantification in rules, but it goes through the effort of explaining a lot of it. And I do think that that's what makes this one of the strongest tools out there, from everything from designing a campaign to designing a pantheon, all sorts of stuff like this, even addressing things like playing on a virtual tabletop and working out with your DM whether you're going to roll physical dice or use the tabletop's version of those dice. Things like this. Stuff that maybe years ago, especially obviously virtual tabletop stuff, was not a requirement. Things you didn't even really think about that are now present in the game, which I do greatly appreciate. Now, it is not all sunshine and rainbows, because some of the stuff that you might have thought was going to get a pretty significant overhaul maybe did not, like pricing for magic items. While they're a little bit, there's less of a range and more of a static number, it is not a number specific to each item, as many of us were hoping for. So it is pretty much, if it's an uncommon item, it's this price. But more importantly, we do now have advice that, yes, magic item shops can exist in your Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition campaign, whereas in 2014 it said they don't exist. So I thought I would just take this time to kind of scroll through a little bit here and talk to you about some stuff that I thought was really interesting. It kind of has just a lot of good advice and a lot of good show and tell. And this is something that we've heard from Chris Perkins and others talking about this Dungeon Master's Guide, is that this DM guide was more show than just tell, right? Rather than just tell you, go make a campaign, they're going to say, okay, here's how to make a campaign, and then here's an example of a campaign, which is definitely, I think, a better thing for a lot of people to make that understanding. And it even has a little section at the beginning that talks about what's different, but the advice, I think, is probably some of the best things that you'll have that kind of makes sense. Even has a little section about scheduling games, which is pretty interesting. Talks about what kind of additional things you might need. All right, preparing a session. An excellent little thing, right? How does everybody prepare? Now, not everybody prepares for their session, and they prepare differently, but it actually gives you a couple of guidelines that are really useful. It says, okay, if you have only 1 hour to prepare for your game, prepare these bullets. And I'm not going to go through everything in depth in this video. We will dive into the specifics and the minutia in future videos, but I kind of wanted to hit on this. But this is a really useful approach. Prep time, okay, if you only have 1 hour to prepare, these are the things you should consider. If you have 2 hours to prepare, take everything we just covered in hour 1, add this on for hour 2, right? So it's steps 1 through 4, or if you have an hour. Step 2, if you have 2 hours, it adds step 1 through 5. It adds steps 6 and 7. And then it says if you have 3 hours, you now add up to 9 total steps, basically allowing you to expand based on how much DM prep time you have, which again, I don't think we've ever had things quantified down like this. And I think a lot of us have probably seen this in our time DMing, right? The sessions where you spend forever planning all of the minutia and your players will never touch on it. So maybe you organize things different. And that's going to be different than what you're going to see if you're running a pre-written campaign, because even if you are running a pre-written campaign, distill it down into like 5 identifiable steps, and they kind of explain it all. Again, we'll probably do a specific video on just the prep time in the future, but this is a really good thing to kind of spell out. And then it talks about, like, okay, how do you run a session? Start with a recap. Is the DM going to do the recap? Is the player going to do the recap? Figure out your encounters, how best to describe the situations, how to let the players talk things out. It says once you describe the situation, ask the players what they want to do. Note that what the players say and identify how to resolve their actions. Describe what happens, right? Are there rules required in here? Do we need to have an obstacle right up a chance of failure? Do you roll a d20? Do you not? Do you just solve it via role playing? It has a little bit about, hey, when you finish a lengthy combat encounter, take a break. Simple things that if you've been running games for a long time, you probably don't need this information. But if you're new or maybe you forgot, just things like, hey, we know we can only do so much with so much time, schedule in a break. And then it also flat out tells you try not to end the session in the middle of an encounter if you can help it. You'll lose a lot of information. Try to finish things up so you can get to a natural good ending point. Then it gives us a nice example of play here. And then it has every DM is unique. What kind of play style do you have as a DM? Are you a hack and slash or immersive role playing? Are you pre-planned or improvised? Morally ambiguous or heroic? And there's a bunch of other options. Ask yourself these questions to help figure out what you want. It has a whole section about house rules. And that's like, hey, I feel like the Dungeon Master's Guide doesn't usually address the concept of you making up rules outside of the rules of the game. It talks about how to figure out rule interpretations, right? If you come up with a rule interpretation on the fly based on something you encounter, track that so that everybody knows, hey, going forward, this is how we rule this. Or track the current version and then update it once you figure out what you want to do. It even says, like, handing things to your players. Delegation. If there's parts of the game that you don't like to do yourself, delegate it to a party member. If you don't want to break your narrative stride by looking up a rule, say, hey, Bill, can you look up this rule for me while I keep going with the story? Hey, if you don't like tracking initiative, give it to a player. Work together. This is a storytelling, adventure you're building together. Why not assign some of the players some of those roles? They even have a tracking sheet for game expectations that you can hand out to the players to kind of give them an idea for what you're looking for and have them write back, sensitive elements, session 0 style stuff, right? You don't like spiders, you don't like snakes, whatever. Hard limit, soft limit. What are your players' hopes and expectations? Any concerns you might have at the table. We don't like sharing dice. We don't like swearing, whatever. And there's a tracking sheet to kind of give you that option to give to everybody. You can have players put their names on it or not, or otherwise whatever you want it to be, anonymous or not. And then you have your kind of X card and all that kind of stuff figured out. And this is an interesting one too that I really like is mutual respect. Whether you're playing with long-term friends or strangers, it's important to create a foundation of mutual trust. The best games happen when everyone at the table feels safe enough to enjoy them. It's up to everyone to uphold the principles of respect. Difficult conversations often fall on the DM to lead, but they don't have to. If one player's behavior is interfering with everyone else's enjoyment, everyone has a stake in resolving that issue. Setting expectations for you as the DM, right? Before you consider making a group around a table, pitch the adventurers you're thinking about running to your prospective players. Hey, I'm going to run a campaign set as underwater. And maybe your players, some of the players you're thinking about having, have like a dreadful fear, aquaphobia or thalassophobia or something like that, and they don't want to deal with being underwater. Hey, that's not for you. We can move on. Hard and soft limits, it talks about the expectation sheets. If your player is, terrified of spiders, maybe don't run something lulth-based for them. Or if you are, probably tell them, hey, I really would love to have you in this campaign, but we're doing something that's all about spiders. You're probably going to want to sit this one out. Communicate those limits, figure out a way to get around, whether it's, an X card or a physical card or what have you. And then it talks about your DM rolls, right? Do you hide your die rolls? Do you show them visibly to everybody? Because that could instill, distrust in that ways. How to avoid, if you have an overly cautious player, how to possibly handle that, right? If this is a player that's going to stop and look under every flagstone, stop every second for traps, how can you as a DM adjudicate that so that they're not constantly bogging the game down by searching everywhere? It has rules to figure that out. As I mentioned with the DM, right, it says, as a DM, you have the right to expect your players to respect you and effort you put into making the game fun for everyone. The players need to let you direct the campaign with their input, arbitrate the rules and settle the arguments, and when you're narrating the action of the game, the players should be paying attention. I know some of you may think that that's self-explanatory, but I promise you, it's not. Sometimes the players need to be reminded, like, hey, I'm doing a thing. Can I get everybody to focus up here? Players should roll dice in full view of everybody. If a player scoops up their dice before anyone else can see what they roll, encourage that player to be less secretive. The social contract of adventures. You must provide a reasonably appealing reason for your characters to undertake the adventures you prepare. In exchange, the players should go along with these hooks. It's okay for your players to give you some pushback on why their characters should want to do what you're asking them to do, but it's not okay for them to invalidate the hard work you've done preparing the adventure by willfully going in a different direction. A lot of people need to hear that one. I'll be honest with you. If you feel like you're keeping up your end of the bargain and the players aren't, have a conversation with them away from the table. Try to understand what hooks would motivate their characters and make sure the players understand the work you put into preparing adventures for them. Don't fight the scenario. Yes, you can push back on some of the implements and the way the DM may be pushing stuff in. But if they're sending you down a clear path and you just are trying to be a dick by going in the opposite direction, don't be a dick. Just, they put this out there for you. Yes, there's a difference between railroading and a sandbox adventure. I think we all understand that. But there's also, like, with the DM's kind of queuing something up for you and you're just purposefully throwing it in their face and going the other way. The social contract of adventures is written here in this Dungeon Master's Guide is like, I'm going to put in the work to tell a fun story for you. Don't just try to throw it all in my face. Now, some people are going to have issue with that. I understand that. Do whatever you want, right? How are you going to handle rules discussions at your table? Character knowledge versus player knowledge. Players exploiting the rules. This is another really good one. Some players enjoy poring over the D&D rules and looking for optimal combinations. This kind of optimizing is part of the game, but it can also cross a line into being exploitative, interfering with everyone else's fun. Setting clear expectations is essential when dealing with this kind of rules exploitation, and bear these principles in mind. Rules aren't physics, the game is not an economy, combat is for enemies, and rules rely on good faith interpretation. Now, there's obviously more specifics that dive into that, but that's a pretty interesting way to just flat out say, hey, listen, if that's the kind of game we want to play, we can talk about that. And then again, as I mentioned, it does have a specific area here for rules with a virtual table. That kind of general high-level overview of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is running the game, and it has a really great section here about knowing your players. What type of game do your players want? And this is why I think I'll probably work on putting it out somewhere. I've kind of developed something loosely for the home game that I'm running for my family, which is a series of questions to ask them about them as the player, and then also a series of questions to ask them about their characters to kind of help get an idea for what kind of stuff I can populate the world with. If you're a puzzle-based DM and you love throwing puzzles at your players, and you find out that your players hate puzzles, well, there may be a conflict of interests there, or maybe we need to switch things up. But, if you find out that, like, one of your players really likes very strong black and white, good and evil, and another member of the party really likes morally gray stuff, well, you're going to have to figure out to add in a way to accomplish both, to try to get things that, if some people really like fighting owlbears, well, you're probably going to have to throw owlbear in there every now and then to kind of give them something to do what they want. So it talks about the different kinds of players, and it says it's very rare that all of the players at the table are going to all fall into the same area, but it gives you some kind of archetypes, and it gives you specifics underneath. We have acting, exploring, fighting, instigating, optimizing, which again was that thing we talked about with like exploiting the rules, problem solving, socializing, and storytelling, right? So a little bit about figure out which one your players kind of fall into, and then get an idea for what they like. Talks about the group size, small groups. You might need to give them more, lesser enemies or more stuff to juice them up if they're too small. DM controlled adventure. It flat out has rules in here if you want to add a DM PC to your game. It even flat out calls it a DM PC. But it tells you this is a rewarding way for you to roleplay with your friends while they're exploring your world, but keep in mind that you'll have to run this as an NPC in combat. Be sure to keep the player's characters in the spotlight and don't take away from the player's agency by having your character make the decisions for the group. So if you're going to run a DMPC, it says that's fine, but like they take a back seat in social encounters unless they're specifically addressed, and then they'll step forward. Otherwise, they're kind of just like an NPC in combat. Talks a little bit about players with multiple characters, and then talks about with large groups. The biggest consideration with large groups are maintaining order at the table and keeping combat from becoming too slow. Consider having a party leader. If you have a large group, I think this is probably 8 or more would be, honestly, I'd say a large group. I'd consider anything more than 5 as a large group, but that may differ. Consider having a party leader who will kind of work with the party and they'll be the one to communicate whatever's happening to the DM. So everybody might have things they want to do, but you could have the party leader be the person who's like, you guys might throw out a lot of the stuff at the table, but unless it's the party leader who's telling me what you want to do as the DM, that's the opinion that counts. You guys figure it out on your own. They give me the bit that I need, and then I go from there. And that might actually be a really smooth way to kind of work out some of the kinks of combat and things. All right, it talks about how do you speed up combat. Be generous with information. Give the players the armor class so that they can roll and figure that stuff out ahead of time. Make initiative very obvious. Encourage the players to roll their attack and damage at the same time. Things you can do to keep things moving. A whole section on how to handle an absent player. Do they just kind of fade into the background? Is there a narrative contrivance that removes them temporarily? Is there a substitute player? Is somebody going to kind of control their character? You're going to bring in another character to kind of fill the role while they're gone. It's about how you could add in a new player. Even options for how you bring them into a campaign that's running. And even as a section talking about guest stars, whether that's just somebody you want to have in for a one-time session, your buddy from out of town came in and wants to jump in the game, or even mentions maybe it's somebody you're trying to add to the main party as part of the main adventure, but you don't really know them that well. And rather than just bring them in, figure out if they gel with the party first by bringing them in to do a guest spot. And if things go well, then maybe then you add them in. We have a section here about possibly the concept of multiple DMs and how that could work, whether that's just switching on and off or having two DMs at the table, how to handle group checks and passive checks, how to determine a DC, how to determine advantage or disadvantage, how to come up with success, even as a specific set of rule in here for critical successes and critical failures. As we know, a natural 20 and a natural 1 outside of an attack roll is not an automatic success or an automatic failure. But it has stuff in here if you'd like to try to do that, or if you want to do degrees of success or degrees of failure. Section on just, improvising damage, how to improvise an answer, how to, it says aids to improvisation, right? Things to have, a list of NPC names, a couple of random tables, a campaign journal, and so on. Talks about how to run a social encounter, how to engage the players, how to deal with the attitude of, we talked about attitude in a couple of shorts videos, how to determine that. A little bit about how to run exploration, tracking time, how to handle perception, how to find hidden things, how far away things can be perceived, how to handle travel. And there's a really cool thing where it has journey stages, which is a new thing that we haven't seen before. It can be helpful to break the journey up into stages. And it has, the following different options here, right? It has, you'd have a travel planner tracking sheet. A whole section here about weather, what and how you're going to handle different things during the journey. We have step 1, set the pace. Step 2, narrate the travel. Step 3, track food and water consumption. And step 4, track progress. We have, again, a weather table. We have a terrain table based on how fast you can travel, what the DC is for foraging, the DC for navigation, and the DC for searching for things. How far things could happen, even with stuff like wind walk or carpet of flying, how fast that can work to get you moving, how to narrate travel, how to deal with, again, almost like in an Oregon Trail way, right? How you're going to handle encounters, foraging, navigation, obstacles, searching for stuff, tracking. Is there going to be an ambush? How do these encounters happen? Is it somebody just, they're being followed? Does it happen by chance? What kind of stuff could they run into with navigation-wise? Do players need to track rations? Like, a lot of these things that, again, maybe throwaway stuff for veteran DMs, but I really like seeing this stuff in here because maybe this is something you've never really thought about as a DM, but now that you see it here, kind of like, oh, maybe I should look into doing that. Again, we jump into combat and how to track things. Even talks about different ways to track a monster's hit points. Do you count up their hit points where you start at 0 and say they have 59 hit points, you count up till you hit 59? Or do you start at 59 and tech off damage until they hit 0? We're now into Chapter 3. They did return the chase rules. I'll be honest, I have not compared them to 2014's chase rules to see if they're any different. Then we get into creating a background. So this has the official rules for creating a background and what you need to do when you want to do that in 2024. A whole set of things for creating a creature. And actually a whole massive list of traits that you can just add to a creature to modify things. But it also has things like talking about, hey, maybe it's just changing a creature's type. Maybe it's just giving it an extra sense. Maybe it's just reskinning an existing creature. How about creating magic items? The same kind of thing, right? Could it be just something like a ring of protection becomes a wand of protection? An altered damage type, right? A flame tongue longsword becomes a lightning tongue longsword. Could you combine the two items together to make a new item? They use a helm of telepathy and a helm of comprehend languages. Combine them together to make a new magic item. And then again, a whole section on creating a magic item, how to handle the power level, how to handle the bonuses, whether or not it should have attunement. A whole section on creating spells, which I don't feel like we've had too much before, about damage, how many targets it can affect, the identity of it, how much healing can it do. We have a whole section here on curses, a variety of things like cursed magic items, getting narrative-based curses. Do you want remove curse to be able to affect it or not? Environmental-based curses. We have a whole section here on magical contagions. This seems to be the updated name, and that seems to be the replacement for things like diseases. But there's a list in here. Okay. How to handle death in your campaign. Don't cheat in the monster's favors. Don't make it personal. Provide fair warning and provide fair encounters. How to scale lethality. I like that it has a section about, like, maybe you should roll your dice out in the open if it's regarding, like, death-related things, so that the players know you're not trying to cheat one way or another. How to deal with maybe they're defeated, but they're not dead. Maybe they just go to comatose state. How to deal with death in a party. How to deal with different ways to survive or deal with a TPK, right? How could you handle that? And there's a bunch of different options on how to adjudicate a TPK. A variety of damage and hit points and things for doors, secret doors, portcullises, and so on. How to basically make a dungeon by adding a bunch of dungeon quirks. How to map out a dungeon. How to design a room, different states of decay within the dungeon, different environmental effects, extreme cold, extreme heat, frigid water, high altitude. A whole section on how to deal with fear in the campaign, as well as mental stress. A couple of different tables and different ways to handle this. And this is less like a creature casting a fear effect on you, more like, you're a character and you're experiencing something absolutely terrifying has happened to you. If you were to see a mind flayer in real life and watch a mind flayer extract a brain from somebody, that's terrifying. While that necessarily doesn't trigger, like, it's not the mind flayer using a fear effect ability, like casting the fear spell on you, that is scary. So it might trigger a roll within one of these kind of the fear effect table kind of option that they have there. Like, it's just scary, therefore it triggers the event, even though it wasn't something actually choosing to do that. We have some expansion on firearms and explosives here, including things like hunting rifles and shotguns, as well as bombs, dynamite, as well as futuristic things like laser rifles and antimatter rifles. As I mentioned earlier, creating a pantheon. How to determine divine rank, how to figure out their home plane and alignment. Are they a demigod? Are they a titan? What does that mean? How do gods and divine magic work in your world? How does divine knowledge pass down? What kind of divine intervention abilities could your deities do? How to create a religion? All useful things that are just nice to have a couple of pages on. Different hazards. We've talked about hazards in the past. It's kind of more environmental stuff. Brown mold, fireball fungus, quicksand. Again, we talked about that a little bit, but there's a whole set about mob rules and, like, minions. How to come up with NPCs. And they have a whole set of names, and I love what they did with the names. Instead of it just being like elf names or orc names, it is common names, guttural sounding names, lyrical sounding names, monosyllabic names, sinister names, whimsical names. Just, figure that out. Now, obviously, if you look at it, you could probably be like, okay, whimsical with a name like Cricket Hottie Peak, that's probably a halfling name. And a guttural name like Badjok Burska is probably an orcish kind of sounding name. But, you can kind of figure that out as you go. Building an NPC's personality, their appearance, and then a whole NPC tracking sheet. What kind of secrets do they have? Are they recurring? Are they party members? All sorts of background here. What's the loyalty level of these NPCs? Are they loyal to your characters? Or are they just kind of, figuring all that stuff out? A whole section here on poisons and a variety of list of different poisons. A lot of these seem to be familiar from what was in 2014. Okay. How about a settlement building section? Defining traits of the settlement. What size is the settlement? Claims to fame, calamities, tavern names, random shops, local leaders. And then a tracking sheet to track all of that. Siege equipment. All right, supernatural gifts like blessings, how they work, blessings and charms. We have a whole section on traps, some example traps, and a little bit about how to build your own trap. And then we get into chapter 4, which is creating adventures. Now, again, we heard a little bit about this, right? We're going to have 5 kind of intro adventures, but talks about laying out, how to design an adventure. What kind of tier are you building it for? Are you doing guide rails or are you doing kind of a railroad situation? And then 20 adventure hooks for each tier of play. I'm sorry, 20 adventure hooks for tier 1 and tier 2 adventures. That's levels 1 through 10. 12 for a level 11 to 16 adventure, and then 10 for a level 17 to 20 adventure. Figure out the setting. They even have a little section about common map symbols. Or if you're drawing stuff on a map, like this is how you draw a statue. This is how you draw a pit. This is how you draw, a door or a double door. How to keep an adventure moving. How to make sure you have something here for everyone. We talked a little bit about random treasure hoards here and monster treasure preference. This will be in the monster manual, but out of the way. Then we have 4 or 5 sample adventures here from a variety of different aspects. Then it gets into creating a campaign. How to, they have a campaign journal tracking sheet here. What's the premise of your campaign? Then it has DM's character tracker. What kind of conflicts, how you're going to set up arcs, flavors of fantasy for your story. Is it heroic fantasy? Is it sword and sorcery, epic fantasy, mythic fantasy, intrigue, supernatural horror, mystery, swashbuckling, war, or some sort of combination of any of those? And it kind of gives you some options about, like, hey, if you're considering doing this, consider these things. It lists off all the official D&D settings to give you examples. How does character creation differ? It talks about setting up a session 0, how to bring the party together, right? Do they meet in a tavern? Do they know each other? What's the starting location for the adventure? How's the first one going to go? And it talks about, you're going to do episodes, or you're going to do kind of serials. Episodes, it says, an episodic campaign is a campaign in which component adventures don't combine to form an overarching story. Episodic adventures are standalone quests, and the villains who appear in one adventure rarely resurface. Versus serials, a serialized campaign is one continuous story broken up into smaller parts that flow naturally from one to the next. Time, how to pass time in your campaign, how to end a campaign, and then again we have Greyhawk as an example campaign. We have a little bit about the conflicts within Greyhawk, a little bit about the setting, months, festivals, faction organizations, how magic is handled, the gods of Greyhawk, a little bit about the free city of Greyhawk itself, how to use the city, how to handle the government, crime, neighborhoods, etc. within the city, some, notable locations. We have the map of the city itself, the different breakdowns of those areas. Then we have the overarching map of Greyhawk itself, what's beyond the walls, the local locations outside of that. Living history of the area here. We have different locations outside of the city. And then a couple of different locations out of multiple areas outside of the city. And that is pretty much all that we have for the Greyhawk campaign. But as you can see, it's giving you a decent idea of, like, okay, here's your hub city. Here's how to add a bunch of stuff to the hub. And then here's how to expand outside from that. Then we get into chapter 6 is cosmology. This is going to have, all the different aspects of the different planes. We can kind of just skip through this. But it's got, a general overarching tour of the multiverse itself. With a little bit of adventure information and then hooks and things for each one of them. And then after we finally make our way through, we get to chapter 7, which is treasure. This is probably the one everybody's waiting for. We do have the treasure broken down into arcana, armaments, implements, and relics. Arcana being kind of magic items, eldritch, wizardy, sorcery, warlocky things. Armaments is coins, trade bars, magic items useful in battle. Implements are basically utility items, and then relics are those that have more of a religious or divine purpose. How to do various trade goods, various gemstones of a variety of different prices, art objects. The potion Misc ability table does make a return. I'm not sure if it's different. It looks to be relatively the same. Okay, magic items available by rarity. Common magic items can be bought in a town or city. Uncommon and rare magic items can only be found in cities, and rare magic items might be in more wondrous locations like the city of Brass or Sigil. Then it has, again, values for each of them. A common magic item is 100 gold, or uncommon is 400, rare is 4,000, very rare 40,000, legendary 200,000, and artifacts are priceless. Just to have the value, if it's a scroll or some sort of consumable, And then it also goes on to say that if the item itself has its own value, so it says for a +1 piece of plate armor costs 1,500 gold pieces in the player's handbook, and a rare magic item, which +1 plate mail is 4,000 gold pieces. So it's telling you to add those two together to make +1 plate armor 5,500 gold pieces. It also has a table. We've talked about this in the past of magic items awarded by level. So apparently in a campaign that gets you to level 1 all the way up to 20, you should have, for the party, 100 total magic items. The breakdown of which is 19 common, 28 uncommon, 23 rare, 19 very rare, and 11 legendary magic items. That's what the breakdown, according to this, should be, roughly. And it has different breakdowns for level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. I thought it was interesting that in a tier 3 campaign for levels 11 to 16, you should have 2 legendary magic items, technically, according to that table. And it has a little bit of breakdown of randomly determining magic items, has a magic item tracker sheet. And then the crafting, it's not a lot. It says, if you want to craft it, you have to have Arcana proficiency. If it's an item, like, say, a piece of armor, you're going to need the associated tool to use that, and it spells it out here. If you want a wand, for example, it's Woodcarver's tool. So you need to have Arcana proficiency and Woodcarver's tools. If that wand casts a spell, like the Wand of Magic Missile, the person's crafting it also needs to have access to that spell. So you'd have to have Magic Missile. And then there's a time and a cost. So to make an uncommon magic item, let's say it takes 10 days and 200 gold pieces. So that's half the price of just purchasing an uncommon magic item. You work for 8 days, so if you worked for 10 8-hour days with 200 gold pieces worth of material, you could make a uncommon magic item. It says assistants can be added to lessen the time, but usually no more than one. Then regarding the raw materials, the DM determines whether raw materials are available. In a city, there's a 75% chance that those materials are available. And in any other settlement, it's a 25% chance. If materials aren't available, you must wait 7 days before you can look for it again. Same using that plate armor. It says for plate armor, you must pay 3,500 gold pieces or pay 2,000 gold pieces and craft the armor. Well, that's just wrong, actually. To make +1 plate armor, you must pay 3,500 gold pieces. But it just said in the previous area that it's 5,500. Yeah, so I think there's a typo there. So I think it's supposed to be 55 or 2,000, but also to craft a rare suit of plate armor, it's going to take you 50 days. And then again, we heard about these magic items, special features, right? Who was it created for? These are basically a direct port from what we saw in 2014, right? The history, the minor properties, quirks, and so on. Artifacts have their major, minor, detrimental, and beneficial properties. Probably something that is new, though, is the section on creating sentient magic items. Has different traits for the magic items, what kind of senses it has, its communication purposes, what is its special purpose if it has one, what's the alignment of the magic item, and how to handle conflict between magic items and the person who's using them. What does it make you do if you kind of butt heads with it? What can it do, right? It can do things like suppress its own magical capabilities, make it impossible for you to attune to it, or attempt to take over your body. And then we just get into the big long list of magic items. Now, I will say, we did hear that a bunch of these were reviewed. I would say probably just from a general glance. Now, it's not everything, but a lot of these that were reviewed, they were just kind of given more options. One of the example they gave is you used to have the arrow of slaying. It is now ammunition of slaying. So anything that uses ammunition can get a piece of ammunition of slaying. There are a few magic items, brand new ones. A lot of the new magic items in this Dungeon Master's Guide are just the common magic items from Xanathar's Guide, just ported over into this book, which does technically make them new to the Dungeon Master's Guide. I'm looking at the Amulet of Health right now. It's exactly the same. It sets your Constitution to 19. No change there. But a lot of the items that you've seen that were once, as they've mentioned before, like a sword it's now a weapon. Like a flame tongue used to be any sword. I think a flame tongue now is any simple or martial weapon. So there's a lot more variety in the options in that way by they're just kind of opening it up to other damage types or other weapon types. I do feel like this is something that most DMs have been doing naturally, but it's nice again to have it officially codified. But like I said, I think a lot of this remains largely the same. There's some things I'm recognizing. I think Baba Yaga's dancing broom might be new to this book. As mentioned previously, a lot more art of a lot of the different aspects, which I do appreciate having different magic item art. Anything that had like specific qualifiers, like Boots of Elvenkind used to say, you got advantage on stealth checks to move silently. Now it's just you get advantage on stealth checks, and then also you make no sound when you're moving, regardless of the surface you're moving across. So again, a lot of the unnecessary complications in like, well, I have advantage on stealth checks. Are they listening or looking? Because then it changes it. Boots of Elvenkind now again just give you advantage on stealth regardless. I think Boots of Shredding and Springing got an update so that they kind of function like they have the jump spell on, where once a turn you can jump 30 feet by using 10 feet of movement. Boots of the Winterlands, interestingly, lost resistance to cold damage, but just or no, I'm sorry, that's Boots of the Winterlands. It's one of these other ones that instead of having resistance, I think it's the Ring of Warmth, actually. It's just like reduce cold damage you take by 2d8. Alignment, that's another one. Anything that used to have pretty much a specific alignment tied to it, it seems like that alignment restriction has been removed. Like Robes of the Archmagi used to have like 3 different colors, and based on the type of alignment you had, would be whether you could attune to it or not. That seems to have been removed, and it's now just Robes of the Archmagi. The Cube of Summoning is a new magic item that lets you kind of cast one of the summon spells without it being concentration. The Deck of Many Things in here is the expanded version that we see from the Book of Many Things with all the extra cards. Things like, again, like I mentioned, the Dragon Slayer. It's any simple or martial weapon could be a Dragon Slayer weapon now, as opposed to just like a specific type of weapon. Some things that were like the Elven Chain is now chainmail or a chain shirt. Dwarven Plate is now half plate or plate armor. We mentioned that all of the D&D cartoon characters' weapons are here. We covered that in a previous video, as those were specifically called out in Uni: The Hunt for the Lost Horn, so we covered all those in great detail. New options are in spelled weapons, armor, and staff. They have different restrictions, but it's basically either a weapon, an armor, or a staff that has a specific spell cast into it of a certain level. The armor has 6 charges, and then you can basically expend a charge to cast that spell from it, and it gets 1 charge back, it gets a d6 charges back at dawn. Haggai, they mentioned, was added. This was in the Monster Manual originally. They moved it here to the Dungeon Master's Guide. Holy Avenger can now be any weapon, which is kind of nice. Luck Blade can now be like things like a sickle, for example, which it could not be before. The Lute of Thunderous Thumping is new, which is just a lute that can be wielded like a club that does extra thunder damage. And if you're a bard, you can use your charisma modifier for attack and damage. I believe this is very similar, if not exactly the same, as Edwin the Bard's lute from the D&D movie, or at least what they did when they made his character sheet for the D&D movie, Honor Among Thieves. The Periaptive Proof Against Poison, which used to be a non-attunement thing that just gave you immunity to poison. That, for example, is attunement. And the Periaptive Health, which used to give you immunity to disease, now is basically a once a long rest regular healing potion, and an advantage on saving throws to end the poison condition on yourself. They've mentioned before the Potion of Pugilism, which is the spinach one. After you drink it for 10 minutes, all of your unarmed strikes deal an extra d6 force damage. This is pretty solid for a monk, somebody who's going to be doing a lot of punching, to just tack on an extra d6 for the expansion of a uncommon potion. Big updates, for example, to the Ring of, Elemental Command. It used to have specifics about like slaying an elemental while you wear the ring. A lot of that stuff is gone. It just provides you general overall better benefits. Robe of Eyes now gives you True Sight, which you didn't do before, I don't believe. that seems to be everything. Oh, they added the wraps of unarmed power to the Dungeon Master's Guide. These were in Fizz bands, I think. They're basically just the ones that boost your unarmed strike damage. +1, +2, +3. Uncommon, rare, very rare to just add damage to your unarmed strikes, attack rolls, and damage. Then we have our magic item tables broken up by those 4 categories. The entire section on Bastions is Chapter 8. From looking at it at a quick glance, it does appear that Bastions are very similar in a lot of ways to what we saw in the Unearthed Arcana, almost identical from a quick glance. I'll have to do a full in-depth dive into everything with a direct comparison. But again, just from a quick glance, it does appear that they remained largely intact. Within, again, there's a Bastion tracking sheet. And then we have the lore glossary, which again just touches on high-level pieces of lore that you should know, right? Who's Driz Do'Urden, what's Baldur's Gate, who's Bigby, I don't know, who's Egwilv, how does Egwilv, and then, Egwilv's actually Tasha, Lord Soth, Misc, Laurel Silverhand, what is Mithril, Neverwinter, Rudolph Van Richten, Strahd von Zarovich, Tiamat, Undermountain, Venger, Vecna, Vlaakith, the Yawning Portal, and so on. Then in Appendix B is a bunch of pre-written maps, or pre-drawn maps that you can utilize. And then it gets into the index. And that's basically the entire Dungeon Master's Guide. Like I said, it's the best written one I've seen. There's an actual want and a need for me to want to go back and read the early chapters where I feel like 2014, I flipped to the magic item section and then just didn't care about anything else. There's actually some pretty useful stuff. I obviously like the magic item section. That's obviously going to be something I use. The Bastion section is also nice. I feel like most of the lore glossary is stuff that I know to some degree, but there are some names in there I don't recognize, so I'll probably review those. But ultimately, I do think this is a better resource than anything we've had in the past. So kudos to Wizards on this one for sure. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments down below. I'll see you all next time.